Okay, we're at 6 o'clock, so we'll begin. Um, Hello and good evening, and a very big thank you to everyone for joining us today. My name is Manoj Kevalramani. I head the Indo-Pacific Studies program and the China research work at the Takshashila Institution. For those who are unfamiliar, Takshashila is an independent, non-partisan center for research and education in public policy. We are concerned with how India shapes the world and how the world shapes India in turn. We are also focused on transforming how India is governed and exploring the intersection of technology, economics, and politics. Before I go any further into today's conversation, I'd like to take a moment and say that I hope wherever you're joining us from, you and your loved ones are safe and healthy. These are difficult times. The past year and the past few weeks in particular have been extremely challenging for all of us. For many Indians across the country, lack of access to adequate healthcare, the grief of losing a loved one, or anxieties about future livelihood, these have been our dominant concerns. Cumulatively, these private individual experiences of ours come together to inform us about the urgency of the task of furthering India's developmental transformation and what we need to prioritize as we pursue that goal. And it is with that in mind that I welcome Ambassador Shivshankar Menon today. He's someone who really needs no introduction. He is a veteran diplomat, a scholar, somebody who served as the High Commissioner to Pakistan and Sri Lanka, as the ambassador to Israel and China, and as India's Foreign Secretary and the National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. Ambassador Menon's new book sort of ties into what I've just said a few minutes before. His new book, India and Asian Geopolitics, the Past, Present, talks about how Indian policymakers over the years have sought to manage, shape, and leverage the external environment in pursuit of the objective of social and economic transformation of India. So we're going to be taking some time and we're going to be talking about a lot of that. And this is a fantastic book for anybody it's extremely accessible for anybody who's new to the subject area and for people who've been studying this, researching this, working in the field of IR or diplomacy or in the armed forces or in research like myself. There is so much new material and so many linkages that I found fascinating. As I was telling Ambassador Menon before we began that my notes of his book are nearly 83 pages long. Joining me to discuss this book are Nitansha Bansal. Nitansha is a graduate in economics. She assists members of parliament with their legislative duties. She's recently graduated from Takshashila's GCPP program, the Defense and Foreign Affairs program. And now she's going to be pursuing further education at Columbia University, and she's looking at that. So Nitansha, welcome. Also on the panel with me to ask Ambassador Menon specifically about China, because that's where he and I, that's something that he and I look at very seriously, is my colleague Suyash Desai. Suyash leads our work on the PLA. And like I said, I'm sure he's going to have a lot to ask Ambassador Menon about the India-China dynamic. And the book has a lot of focus on the rise of China. So with that, Ambassador Menon, welcome. Nitansha and Suyash, welcome. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. And thank you for asking me. It's good of you.
So I want to sort of begin by, Ambassador Menon, talking to you about just the breadth and the depth of the book. I mean, and we spoke about this briefly before we began. You've covered such a large sort of time period. You've spoken about not just from independence, you've also sort of gone before independence, and you spent time talking about India's engagement in World War II also. And then you talk about sort of, the different sort of ifs and buts that could have taken place in the process of Indian foreign policy through these decades. So for example, at a certain point of time, you highlight the possibility of you highlight the debate between Panikkar and Patel and Nehru with regard to India's foreign policy objective. What should be the primary objective? You talk about, the role of the sort of potential thaw between India and China that could have taken place in late 60s and early 70s if the Nixon, Kissinger, and Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong talks were not happening at that point of time. So there are lots of counterfactuals that are also in there. So firstly, I wanted to take a look at why did you sort of approach it with such breadth? Why did you feel the need to sort of begin with something like this, such a broad canvas?
Thank you, Manoj. Thanks for that. And actually, the reason this grew. And it, frankly, I didn't expect it to grow the way it did sideways. I mean, really, because frankly, when, what I miss in most academic literature about Indian foreign policy or security policy is the fact that many things are happening at the same time. And that when people take decisions, it's not only the logic of that particular issue or that relationship, or whereas invariably when we study, say, India-China relations or the India-China boundary, we go into great detail about the pros and cons and all the things that they must have thought this, they could have seen that. But we don't look at the lateral picture. And frankly, that's what the politician does, much more than the academic or even the bureaucrat or the diplomat who specializes. The politician sees 360 degrees. He thinks of his home constituency, thinks of the effect on other relationships with other countries. He sees a whole much more complicated universe than I think we do, because we are simplifying to understand, right? I mean, that's our method, and we drill down into it. And the more academic you are, the more detailed you get into this. And the more narrow, actually, the more narrow your vision seems to become. And that's one reason why I thought it worth lumping it together. But there is a risk here. It becomes dense. It becomes very hard for people to read. And I was very nervous about this book, because it's such a contrast to my first book, which was very simple. It was, 5 simple case studies, and there was a clear logic to what it was saying in each case. And this is the exact opposite, as you said, and you're quite right. But this is the reason why I thought it worth doing in this way.
No, and I agree with you. I think it comes out through the book because you end up making so many connections that you otherwise would not have when you're looking at a certain development in history. And some of these, like I said, were really fascinating to me because, for example, at a certain point in time, you talk about the end of the Cold War and the fact that in many ways that was a moment of glory for Pakistan. It had succeeded in its mission, yet it suddenly found itself in a difficult new world where its utility had reduced. And that's one of the things that, we don't often think about in that context. But I'm going to sort of leave some of these specific questions for much later. Another sort of meta question that I had was, why look at India's place in Asian geopolitics, particularly at a point of time where it seems like, and I probably am jumping the gun in saying this, but it seems like India seems to be pulling back from Asia. We sort of chose to stay out of RCEP. There's a certain limitation to our engagement, particularly with East Asia. And that's reflected in East Asian views of India's clout and influence and economic engagement in that region. And we seem to be now negotiating economic treaties and free trade agreements with Europe and talking about America. So we seem to be moving west in some ways. But why locate us in Asia at this point of time then?
Well, you've partly answered the question. I mean, when I started writing the book and when I started teaching the course, actually, on which the book is based, I was worried that A, we were closing our mind, B, that we always concentrate on India's relationship with big powers or with Pakistan or with China, with the US, with Russia and so on. But we don't look at the whole picture, as we started off saying. And our home is Asia. It's Asia that affects our security, our prosperity directly. And increasingly so, especially now that Asia is central to global geopolitics and the global economy. That's when I started. And frankly, when we walked out of the RCEP, when we raised tariffs for 4 successive years, and I saw what I saw, maybe I hope I'm wrong, as a closing of the Indian mind, as it were. That really worried me because, and I think this is the basic message of the book. For me, India has been most successful, most prosperous, most secure when she's most connected to the world and most engaged with the world. And India's world is Asia and has been through history. Today, it might be the globe, but today you're in a globalized world. But throughout history, it's been Asia. It's been the subcontinent, the Indian Ocean region. And so that's one big reason why I thought I should write about Asia and Asian geopolitics. I looked for a better word than geopolitics, frankly, because, geopolitics has all these negative implications. But I couldn't find one which summed up the basic drivers of state policy that, which cover geography, history, because for me, geography is very important. Where you are is affects how you see things, what your options are, everything. And I think that's an old-fashioned idea, maybe a little unfashionable today. But geography, history, resource endowment, basics, demographics.
Yeah.
So that's what I try and look at in this book.
So let's look at Asia. At a certain point in the book, you talk about Asia essentially being a universe with multiverses, or sort of multiverses existing in Asia, right? And you talk about 16th century Asia, where you talk about a multiverse centered around Egypt and Persia in the West, India and the Indian Ocean region, maritime empires of Srivijaya and its successors in Southeast Asia, and on China in Northeast Asia. And you say that. That to your mind, this is the historical norm in Asian geopolitics, and is one possible future that we might return to after the aberration of the last 2 centuries. How do you see Asia today? Is it heading in that direction?
Everyone has their own version of the historical norm, I must confess. Mine is only one. I mean, Carol, I think, was the first one in 2007 when she started saying, Asia post Vasco da Gama era, we're now returning to historical norm. She saw something else. The Chinese see tributary system and China at the center of the world as historical norm. So I'm not claiming this is where we're going. I'm just saying this is the way I see the past. And because these three multiverses, as it were, they had a lot to do with each other, exchanging goods, people, ideas, religion, you name it. But they did not get involved in each other's politics, their internal politics, or their external security. They actually had very little to do with each other. On the fringes, yes, we did with Persia, but that is it. And for me, actually, but we're not fated to repeat our history. In fact, I'm not sure. When later on in the book, I think I argue that Asia faces three possible futures. So one of them, centered around a single power, either China, the US, whoever wants to. I think Asia's geography makes that difficult. I think that's an unlikely outcome. The other, of course, where you get some kind of unified security architecture, some larger concert of Europe kind of thing, maybe, whatever. But I don't think that's very likely, given the fact that change is so rapid. The balance of power shifting every day almost before our eyes. So for me, the most likely is not a very happy situation. Maybe like Europe at the end of the 19th century, a globalized world, but several powers rapidly rising together and maneuvering among themselves, and all at different levels of development, of power, of economic strength. And let's see, we have to be wise if we want to survive a world like that and do well in it. It's not an easy world to manage. That seems the most likely to me. But foretelling the future, you're almost sure to be wrong. That's one thing I've learned. So but for me, Asia is our home. And what happens in Asia will affect our security, our prosperity directly, more and more. So for me, actually, I don't think it's a choice of, let's look east, let's look west, east is getting difficult, let's go west. That's not how I think we can actually manage our affairs. I think so for me, we need to now concentrate on Asia and maybe spend a little more time with our immediate neighbors and concentrate on these relationships.
How do you sort of see the idea of, or do you see it as a sort of old wine in a new bottle, the idea of the Indo-Pacific as a concept, as a governance concept, as a geographic construct, as a political construct? How do you see that?
I think it's a fine construct for maritime security, because that's what it talks about, this extended body of water, which stretches from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of the Americas. Fine. But it's only a part of our issue, because India is both a continental and a maritime power. And our future is going to be determined also by what happens on the Eurasian landmass. I mean, one of our biggest issues is the world's biggest boundary dispute with China on land. And what happens at sea is not going to solve this. It might be linked, but it's not going to be a direct sort of answer to this. So for me, Indo-Pacific is good, useful, as long as we remember its limits. And it has intrinsic limits as well. I mean, the situation in the Western Pacific and the seas near China and in the Indian Ocean is very different. If you look at the actual balance of power, you look at the geography. Indian Ocean, an open geography. Closed seas like the seas near China, good battle spaces. And the balance in the South China Sea, for instance, it's getting close to becoming a Chinese lake. I mean, but Western Pacific, nowhere near that. But Suyash knows this much better than I do. So for me, therefore, it's not like there's one answer. And here, Indo-Pacific, this is the magic key. You'll notice we keep using different phrases.
Yeah.
And we've never hit on a good term to use. There's no term that's been used consistently by everybody for more than 5 years or 10 years. And each one becomes controversial. And that just shows our confusion, our mental confusion, and how complicated the situation is.
Yeah. So my last sort of meta question before I let Nitansha and Suresh ask the questions that they have, and we'll go into more specific questions. But before I ask my last meta question, I just want to tell the audience, please feel free to use the Q&A feature to share your questions, share your thoughts. I'll try and come to them as quickly as I can. And the more questions, the better, the less you'll hear me speak. So my last sort of meta question is that, and this is a thread that runs through the book. You talk about the role of personalities, events, domestic constituencies, and the balance of power, and how those shape foreign policy and engagement externally. I want to sort of try and understand which of these is a dominant determinant. Is it that personalities eventually sort of determine things, or is it that something where in representative democracies it is the domestic constituencies? Because a lot of the criticism of Indian foreign policy in the past has been about the lack of being able to sort of transact because of domestic constituencies. So is that a serious enough limitation, or are there sort of instances where personalities can override those, or events can override those?
You've really nailed me to the wall here, because I think it varies. But in every country that we know of, politicians take the ultimate call, right? And in any such country, I'm not talking about military dictatorships, or in any country where politicians take the call, it's about their political future. So ultimately, there will be a domestic calculus at the top of the list.
Okay.
But it'll be affected by the other things that you mentioned, by the events, by how pressing they are, how they affect other national interests. But his primary calculus will be what's going to happen to regime survival and my power. And so I think that you can't avoid personality there. Because how he perceives that depends on his experience, his personality, what he brings to the job. I say because most of them are he, but maybe he, she, whatever. So it's very hard to say which one of these, but if I had to look for a central element on which I would then hang the analysis of the events, other things, it would be domestic political survival. And I think the best example of that is China, where given a choice, every time the regime has chosen domestic political survival and insisted on that. Whenever it faced a fork in the road, Tiananmen, various stages, right from the beginning, you can choose this. I think the trouble with liberal democracies is we tend to fudge the issue. We like to cloak it all in principle and morality, and that we're doing the right thing by everybody. And so we use a liberal rhetoric to justify pretty selfish decisions, selfish and manipulative decisions. I don't think India has been any less transactional than any other countries. I'm just considering what you said. But yes, our own rhetoric, I think, has led us into this. Many Indians think, oh, you're so moralistic, you've done things because you have some altruistic motives. I'm not sure that that's really very true. And certainly other people don't think that about us. Ask any of our smaller neighbors. I don't think they have any such illusions.
I think for the realists in the audience, that must really be something that's heartening to learn. I'm going to turn to Nitansha. Nitansha, please go ahead with your intervention.
Sure. Thank you, Manoj. So, sir, I'll take a cue from the last thing that you just recently said about how India perceives itself and how China, there's a difference between China and India. So, you write in your book that how we as citizens perceive our situation and choose to build our narrative deeply affect our future. So, and you also talk about how there's inaccurate representation of India's policy, especially foreign policy in media. So, how do you suggest that what is the way to correct the narrative in the country? Is following in India, China's footsteps the right way?
Well, firstly, I don't think controlling the narrative is the main task of either Indian foreign policy or Indian diplomats or of academics. I think I actually believe there is an objective truth and an objective reality that we're dealing with here, which I don't think all those who believe in narratives and discourses and the postmodernists, I think, have their own view of this. But I don't hold to that. Secondly, I'm not sure there's always a correct narrative. This is not an engineering problem, politics. Politics is a process. And problems mutate, they become benign, they become acute, they become malign, various things can happen. But it's not, even the India-China boundary, for instance, if you settled the boundary tomorrow, drew a line, both sides sign an agreement, it's just the problem would change into a different thing. What do you do with the people, the cross-border ethnicities? What do you do with border trade? You would deal with a whole different set of issues, which might be much easier, but you'd still have issues. So for me, I'm not sure there's always a correct narrative. I think what's important is what outcomes do you want? And how do you determine your outcomes? And that's where narrative, perception, all this becomes important. Because if your brain is foggy and clouded, and if you come in with all these ideas that this is the only thing that's right, or if you come in with a huge ego, you're unlikely to see reality, and you're likely to set targets and aim at controlling the narrative rather than changing outcomes. And that's one of the points I try and make in the book, is that as long as you concentrate on outcomes, you come out relatively better. But if you concentrate on narrative, image, all these parts of it, I don't think it works very well. And I think we have ample proof of that in the last 72 years. And so I don't think we should try what China's doing. China spent what, about $26 billion on its external projection, and look at her image. I mean, she has less soft power than Greece has, if you actually measure it. So I'm not so sure that's a good way to go. But it is attractive to certain kinds of people, and there's no question. And it makes life so simple, right? The media will only say what government wants it to say, and we will project this image of monolithic unity. Nobody will believe us, nobody will follow it, but we will feel good, happy, and we can fool ourselves into thinking. And frankly, many Chinese understand the problem. It's not as though the Chinese don't understand that, and they do actually write articles, they do speak about, they discuss pretty fundamental things. And this is where I think we should learn from China. China's a closed society with an open mind.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think we're an open society with a closed mind. You look at the Chinese, they are ready to discuss issues. I mean, Ko Chao Kwang writes a book saying, what is China? If an Indian historian born in 1950 wrote a book like that, what is India? He'd be accused of being anti-national. I mean, think of what would happen to him or her. Yeah. So for me, there are some things about China that are worth the pragmatism, the open-mindedness about things that don't affect regime survival. I think there are things there that are worth learning, but certainly not their attempt to control the narrative.
All right. Nitansha, I'm going to come back to you. Suyash, since we've been talking about China, I wanted to come to you. Go ahead with your intervention.
Ambassador Menon, first of all, I would like to congratulate you for two extremely insightful books on Indian foreign policy. I have two questions. First, multiple analysts across ideological spectrums have agreed on India needs I have agreed that India needs to rethink its China policy. According to you, how should India approach China? I'll say in diplomatically, militarily, economically, and in unconventional sectors like space, cyber, perhaps nuclear. That's my question number one. And question number two is specifically regarding the institution of National Security Advisor. Since it has changed from when you were holding the institution, especially under Modi government's second term, how has it changed and how this change is manifesting into national security policy making, especially regarding China? These are my two questions. Thank you.
On rethinking China policy, I've been saying for some time, in fact, from before the events of last year on the border, that we need to reset China policy because signs of stress in the relationship have been evident since at least 2012, more likely all the way back to 2008. But certainly since 2012, we've seen accumulating signs of stress. And finally, what happened last year makes it clear that you need to reset the relationship. And how do we reset it? We need to have I think what has fundamentally changed is China's behavior. In fact, part of the problem is that India's behavior didn't change at the same time. We kept making the same assumptions and doing similar things. It became predictable, and which is why spring last year was a surprise. I mean, let's be honest among ourselves. So for me, China's behavior has changed. Figure that out, but more important, figure out what are your core interests right now. Which are the things that really matter to you? And given the changes in Chinese behavior, given the situation that we're in, what's the best way to pursue them? Find your best way forward. Whether it is cyber security, whether it's space, whether each of these, they have to form part of an integrated national security strategy. And China has to be a part of that bigger strategy. Because you can't just say, I'm going to respond to every change. Then you're purely reactive. Then, frankly, the Chinese will decide where you end up with this. I mean, the outcomes will be determined by what they do. So for me, that process, that internal process, that can't be done by you and me sitting outside and, we don't have access to the necessary information and the intelligence and so on. B, so what if we come to the right conclusions? We're not running this country. And that has to be done seriously within government. I know there's thinking going on. And there are lots of the things that I would recommend are happening, whether it's military reform, some of these things. I'm not sure. My worry is that just like military reform, theater commands, all these are very good ideas, having a CDS and so on. But it has to be part of a larger doctrine and a doctrinal shift and an understanding of how you will use military power and its limits also. And that, I don't see that kind of discussion in India. I mean, I have the same problem with foreign policy. I don't see a vision that matches the changed situation that we're in today. But with China, certainly. So that's how I would, now I can tell you what I think a China strategy would be, but frankly, it'll take, a long time because to break it down. But primarily for me in this situation, and given Asian geopolitics today, we need to self-strengthen. There's no other way. And there's external balancing is not going to solve this problem. Even maritime is not going to solve our problem on land. This is our own problem to deal with. And we will have to find ways of dealing with it, whether it's symmetric, asymmetric, whatever. But we should play our game by our rules, not China's game by China's rules. And we need to attack the enemy's strategy. I mean, those are the sort of basics I would go back to, and then make the calculus. And I think we can do that. I don't think it's difficult. And I think, frankly, the defense, the armed forces have a very clear idea of what can and cannot be done. And I think they know. But my worry, I'll tell you frankly, is if we go on in this sort of limbo, without a reset, without a very clear enunciation of either doctrine or of vision of where we're going with China, without an actual engagement with China itself, because a lot of this will ultimately end up, it has to be tested against China itself. You have all kinds of bad consequences. We've seen when you have prolonged standoffs with no clarity on goal and so on, what happened between 59 62? You ended up politicizing the generals. That's not a good outcome. And you saw where that ended. So you need, there's a whole host of other subsidiary calculations which follow from that initial clarity on goals. I don't know if I'm being clear here, but you know where I'm driving with this. On the other thing about the NSA's institution, we were the first parliamentary democracy to create this institution. The British, the Japanese came and learned from how that worked, because after all, ours is a system based on cabinet responsibility, right? So the NSA, in the US system, it's different. Executive authority is with the president. He only shares some of it with the Senate. But basically, it's with the president. And he can exercise this power however he wants, through an NSA, through his cabinet members, through whatever he wants. It's pretty personalized in the US system because it was done in the 18th century. But in our case, even PM's power is, theoretically at least, the executive power of the union is in PM and the cabinet. And we seem to be shifting towards a more presidential way of exercising power internally, in practice. But there's a big difference. In the presidential form, the NSA can be both advisory and operational. Of course, operational NSA's reputations are not as good as those who were in the US, as those who were purely advisory. In India, because of the parliamentary system, and if the constitution works the way it should work, the NSA is an advisor. He's what his name says, National Security Advisor. And he's the advisor to the PM. And then the decision is still PM and the cabinet and whatever. So the whole NSCS is to take a holistic view. There were good reasons for forming it, and I think it was necessary. But in historical terms, this is only the fifth NSA. And each one has done the job quite differently. Maybe because each one has a very different personality, but whatever the reason, fact is, it's still an evolving institution and it still has to find its place. And so I wouldn't jump to conclusions about, I think it's necessary, it's essential actually. And it's not just NSA, but the whole NSCS and what it's done to actually systematize thinking and to take a holistic view across issues. It's the only place, by the way, which is truly purple, where services, civilians, everybody, intelligence, everybody sits around a table and deals with these issues.
Okay, I'm going to pick some questions from the audiences before I come back to Nitansha and Suyash, and there are lots of them. And I'm going to try and sort of consolidate some things. Firstly, I'm going to look at our immediate sort of geographic neighborhood, South Asia, the Indian subcontinent. Firstly, the challenges of Indian foreign policy, particularly in the last 5-10 years with regard to South Asia, we seem to have been struggling. And we seem to have not move forward on issues like connectivity, although we seem to have recognized the fact that connectivity is strategic, yet we've not sort of done too much. So one of the questions that Bharat Bhatt asks is, do you think a Schengen-like area in Europe that exists, is something like that possible in South Asia? And I would sort of add to that saying, is it desirable given the impact on domestic policy in India of migration?
Well, today it might look very unlikely, given the nature of polarized domestic politics, and when you have people calling some neighbors termites and so on, this seems unlikely. But for me, it is a strategic imperative for us to not just be connected to our neighbors, but to integrate them into our larger security and prosperity. We can't prosper just alone in the subcontinent. We can't be an island of prosperity. And in any case, if you look at what's happening, South Asia has done well in the last 2 decades. Bangladesh has probably done better than us on most human development indicators. So we need to work with our neighbors, and we need to be seen by them as a source of security, prosperity, and stability in the subcontinent. Now, you have peculiar problems with Pakistan, but that doesn't stop you from working with everybody else to create this kind of. So, Schengen is a means. Movement is something that all these states in the subcontinent will find difficult for the time being because we have cross-border ethnicities. Our borders are porous. You look at what's actually happening, you get an idea of the numbers of people who cross these borders and work in each other's countries when you look at the figures for remittances, which in many cases are more than the figures for trade between our countries in South Asia. And both ways, remittances from Bangladesh to India, from India to Bangladesh. It's worth looking at these. So the reality of what's happening in the subcontinent is quite different from what the states think they are doing. Even trade is probably 3 times what the official figures tell you it is. We call the rest smuggling, but it shouldn't be. This is normal. In a situation where the borders are porous, they're new, the states are new, and nationalism is still being formed, it's going to be difficult. But the fact is that people do cross these borders. Some of them are open, with Nepal, for instance. But we've been trying to fence boundaries which really cannot be fenced and which actually does damage. It criminalizes not just the local populations, it criminalizes your border guarding forces as well. And that's not a good outcome from my point of view. So it seems to me it's in your own interest to actually integrate, not just economically, but in terms of security and so on. And you can find ways. You don't have to change the boundaries because these are new states with old nations maybe, but very new states. And these are all, many of these boundaries are on the ground, they don't work. You saw what happened in Mizoram when the center said, close your border to Myanmar after the army takeover. What did they say? We can't keep our kin out. And they let them in. And they will, because Chin are Mizos, and vice versa. It's not, they're the same tribes, the same people, the same Zo, if you don't mind the word. There are those who object to it. But anyway, so it seems to me that this can be done. There will be friction, accept it. These are new states, they're still building nationalism. Some of them, Pakistan, for instance, builds it against India. And therefore, there'll be much more friction and much harder. They got independence from you. You might have got independence from the British. But the others are not necessarily doing that.
Yeah.
But you have to let them build their nationhood and do that. They will look for outside balancers. Why? Because you are such a preponderant presence in everything in their lives. Whether it's economically, their risk of being strangled by you, or just you're rolling over in your sleep and hurting them, which happens very often when you stop onion exports, for instance, because there's a shortage in a state which is facing an election. So you need to expect them to look for external balancers. It used to be the US, now it's China. Step up your game. You have advantages here which nobody else has. Look at Bangladesh. Just open up border hearts. You have proximity working for you. And if you then can't handle security, you can't securitize all these relationships to the point where you stop normal life for your people. And in the long run, that's a strategic mistake. I don't think fences are the answer at all. But anyway,
let me
long answer about how I think we should approach South Asia.
Let me attach one more thing to this. What role should the idea of democracy and democratic values play in our engagement in our neighborhood? I mean, we've seen what's happening in Myanmar. We've seen, you get this a lot, particularly on social media, which is never a good barometer for anything. But still, you get this a lot where, other question about, so India is working with like-minded democracies as part of the Quad, yet when there's an issue in Myanmar, India is not talking about the values of democracy, and it's not sort of, putting its weight behind the democratic movement. What role should these values play in our foreign policy? Because we saw in some ways, when you talk about Nehru in the book, you talk about how he balances that degree of his own sort of value propositions with realism. How do we do that today?
Well, I'm not sure. If you're a true Democrat, it should be for them to decide their own fate, right? I mean, self-determination, you have to believe in. Not that you tell them to be democratic, or you decide how democratic they are, or you give them a certificate, or you say, do it this way, without an election, we won't accept you. That's not your business. So for me, it's not, there's this contradiction between people who say we should have a value-driven foreign policy, democracy should be the value. Now let's go force this down somebody else's throat. That doesn't sound right to me. Secondly, you first have interests, which you have to work with. And you can't just turn your back on your interests and say, I'm going to chase some abstract principle and my definition of it, which other people may not agree with. And that's not quite how the world works. Our job is to create outcomes that work for India. It might sound selfish, but that's our job as diplomats, as any foreign security policy has to do that. And if democracy helps, good. If it doesn't, still pursue your interests in whatever way you can. So I'm not sure. In the Myanmar case, for instance, Myanmar has fundamental issues internally about their own contract among themselves, with all these ethnic groups. Now, this religious divide with the Rohingyas. They have their own issues, which are not new issues. We have consistently, from Nehru's time, we have worked with them. They used to have foreign armies, Kuomintang troops on there. They had Communist Party of Burma. They had, and I remember, who was it? UNU, who said that Burma wouldn't have survived if it weren't for military assistance that Nehru gave.
Yeah.
And we have consistently worked with whoever's in Burma, Myanmar, and whoever's in power there in order to try and work our interests primarily, but also when it comes to democracy, to try and offer the Tatmadaw and others an off-ramp, which they can accept. They have to accept it ultimately. And this is where working with ASEAN, with the others, makes so much sense. Because there's no amount of our saying this is the right way and we're going to impose sanctions is going to work. I mean, we've been through this before. Barack Obama came in, when was 2010, November. Remember? And he gave us a lecture about Myanmar in Parliament. In 2 years, he was doing with Myanmar what we were doing, which is talking to them. He'd sent Hillary Clinton there, the Secretary of State. And the Myanmaris moved towards a form of democracy that they were comfortable with. Now they've fallen out among themselves. They'll have to find their own equilibrium, but we can only offer them ways to do that. We can offer them off-ramps, we can offer them an environment in which they can actually move in what we would think is the right direction. But in the meantime, we can't sacrifice our interests.
All right, fair enough. I think that also answers one of the audience questions about which Gaurav Jabuli had raised. I'm going to take a couple of more audience questions and tie them up with something that I found fascinating in the book. In the book, you spend time discussing Pakistan through the decades, but Pakistan is not the focal point of your analysis, it's very unlike what you see in the media, or at least what we used to see in the media for at least till a year or so ago, where Pakistan was the focal point of Indian foreign policy in many ways. In the book, you talk about Pakistan at many different points of time. Given the environment today, we have some sort of a dialogue that's restarted with Pakistan right now. We have major change that we're on the cusp of in Afghanistan. How do we look at that dynamic? And at the moment in the dialogue on Afghanistan, we aren't party to some of these dialogues that are taking place. For example, the quadrilateral dialogue with the Americans, the Chinese, and the Pakistanis. How does India sort of manage that flux that's down the road next few months?
Well, I think, we will, over the next year or so, I think various neighbors of Afghanistan will have to start taking stands on things that in the past they were quite happy to freeload on the American presence on. in terms of security, for instance. I mean, the Americans were doing their job for them, so they could afford to adopt, postures. They could support proxies in Afghanistan. They could do whatever they wanted. But once the Americans go, the rubber hits the road. And who has to first deal with the consequences of what could come out of Afghanistan? Pakistan, China in Xinjiang, Iran in Sistan. So the immediate neighbors are going to have those who are actually in physical contact. And as I keep saying, the risk is not Afghanistan being Pakistanized. I mean, that at least by now we should have learned. Afghanistan is the one country that's never had a secessionist movement and has a very strong drive to independence, to running its own affairs. I mean, it's why it's not called the graveyard of empires for nothing. So it seems to me Pakistan is going to have some hard choices to make about how it deals with Afghanistan, China, Iran, Russia, us, all of us. For me, the logical way is, again, the Afghans will decide their own political future, whether peacefully or by war or whatever. They have plenty of experience. They've done it for hundreds of years. They'll do it again. But the sensible thing for the rest of us would be to hold the ring and create conditions in which they can do that peacefully and move on with their life. And we can limit what could come out of Afghanistan, which is extremism, terrorism, etc. Will we manage? I don't know. We have opportunities to have that conversation, individual opportunities. But I'm not privy to what we've actually been saying and doing, and whether we're willing to use things like the Istanbul process to achieve that goal. But that would be the way forward. But if I were Pakistani, I'd be very worried. And if I were Chinese also, because I'd have investments there and the risk of things going horribly wrong from my point of view.
Okay, that's so fascinating.
So I am less worried from an Indian point of view, actually. We haven't been fiddling in their politics. We haven't been part of their internal civil wars the way that these other countries have been. We haven't chosen sides. And frankly, I also don't think that our so-called terrorism problem from Afghanistan, I think, is exaggerated. We have a terrorism problem from Pakistan, not from Afghanistan. So I think we need to be a little clear about, so let's not whine and panic and, shout and scream. And let's not start acting as though we want to play a big role and we're going to do big things here. Things are all in flux. Sit back and watch. There's a time there will be time for us to make up our minds about how exactly we respond tactically. But strategically, I think we should be quite clear what really matters to us.
Fascinating. I hope that answers questions raised by Anish, Ashutosh, and a couple of others. There are obviously questions that cover a whole gamut of things, which I'm not going to be able to get to. But Nitansha, you had another question. Please go ahead.
Right. So I actually want to congratulate Sir first, because I was really happy about and grateful to him for writing the book. And now after this discussion, I feel there's more happiness and I should control it because I think there's more to come from Sir. So, Sir, I'd like to take the discussion a little to the west of India now. And as we talk right now, there's a conflict going on between Israel and Palestine. And I want to understand what is the role that you envisage for India, and how is this event going to shape the Asian geopolitics?
Well, I think three things have happened. I mean, I think what we've seen, Hamas managed to surprise Israel, clearly. And there is a real risk, I think, that, secondly, that Israeli politics itself is playing a big part in what we're seeing, because it seems to suit Mr. Netanyahu and Hamas to prevent the formation of a national unity government in Israel, which would have included. Thirdly, for the first time, you're seeing actually ethnic violence on the streets of Israel, in Israeli cities. So the risk is that this common interest in preventing national unity governments in Israel and so on between Hamas and Mr. Netanyahu, who is about to lose power, that this could lead to consistent escalation, involving then, Iran through Lebanon, through Hezbollah, and a whole set of other escalations. And so I think when we say stop the violence now, I think that's essential. And I find it really sad that, this is being prevented, that even the Security Council can't even say just stop fighting. I mean, that is really pathetic. And it shows you actually how far the multilateral system has sunk. In the longer run, this is an immediate crisis, therefore. And it's a crisis where it also comes at a time when Iran is heading for elections, presidential elections, and they now have some nominations. I mean, Ahmadinejad's name is back. So this is a complicated time. So I'm very nervous about trying to predict where this is going on the ground tactically in the next few weeks. I think a lot of combustible elements have actually come together, unfortunately. And this is a different crisis. It's not yet another, Israel-Palestine, the Palestinian terrorists have attacked Israel. No, that's not the way I see it. Longer term, I think, two things. One is, I think the only lasting solution is a two-state solution. And all this talk of a one-state solution is that I don't think we should get sucked into that at all. I think it's going to make, the crisis itself is going to make all this fence sitting that many of the Sunni monarchies of other Arab countries did. I think it's going to make their lives a little more difficult because they will have to now be seen. But, in the Middle East regimes are capable of infinite flexibility on their principles. So I think that, let's see where that goes. But what about India? We have traditionally managed, and we're the only country who has managed good relations with all the regional powers at the same time and have done so consistently. Worked with Iran, worked with Egypt, worked with even Turkey, though that's been rocky. Worked with Israel. We've had a very good relationship with Israel. And I don't see why that should change. We had a very good relationship with Israel right through even when our views on the Palestine issue were quite clear and very different from Israel. And I don't think we should allow our policy dictated by our interests to be determined by anybody else. And there, I think, especially here in West Asia, I think it's very important. And you have to remember the basics. 7 million Indians living and working there. We need them. We need the oil. We need the remittances. I mean, that's not a small amount when you're talking 73 odd billion dollars or something. These are large amounts. So, and we need peace in the Gulf because that's where they live and work. We don't want them radicalized. We don't want our people radicalized. So we have a set of interests there which we need to serve. And that only works if we work with everybody. It doesn't work by, and frankly, I think the Palestinians are important because if you want a stable West Asia at the end of this, the US might have much less interest today, actually, since she's now a net exporter of oil. She might have less interest and might think that she can afford to disengage or move away. Let's see who will fill that vacuum. And on the maritime security side, in fact, I've said that I think that countries who today depend on freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf, Hormuz, like India, like China, like Japan, like Korea, we need to actually pick up the slack from what the US Fifth Fleet used to do. And they're now talking about reviving the First Fleet further east. And they can only do that by cannibalizing these fleets, the ones that are no longer so important. So let's see how this develops. So in the long run, I think we need to stick to the basics and be quite clear-headed about what we do. But this crisis is different. And it is more dangerous because of this combination of domestic politics. To go back to your first question, Manoj,
Yeah. So I'm really happy that Nitansha asked this question, because this is also one of the questions that has been in the Q&A box. We've got about 6 minutes left, and I'm going to go to my final question. There are lots of comments and questions in the box which are about things like India's UNSC seat aspiration, specific issues with regard to India's no first use policy, or with regard to Chabahar, or with regard to a relationship with Pakistan, and so on and so forth. I would advise people, please go read the book. He covers quite a few things, particularly if you're interested in nuclear policy. He talks about the significance of that throughout the decade. So please go and check that out. I want to come to my final question, which is based out of your final chapter in the book, where you talk about the future. You talk about how India at present has no existential threats that are external, but the challenge being internal. You talk about three critical challenges broadly today that India faces. One is the intellectual challenge of conceiving our place. The second is a practical one of devising policies. And the third is a broader challenge of grand strategy. I want you to sort of take 5 minutes and just flesh this out for us. What do you mean when you outline all of these? And how do you think we're doing? What's sort of your critical assessment of how do you think we're doing on this?
Well, on our place in the world and what kind of world we want, we are going through an internal argument, right? We're renegotiating our own internal social contract today. So we are much less clear. As long as we were clear that we wanted to build a democratic, secular, essentially liberal, prosperous, and secure India. And that's basically what our constitution says. Once you made that contract, then the rest flows from that. What kind of world you want? You want the world more democratic, you want the world orderly, you want a peaceful world, because you're concentrating on changing India at all and developing India. So today we're arguing about the basics at home. We're not clear. We're much more polarized in terms of opinion. There are those who don't buy into secularism, there are, at least judging by their practice, who don't seem very democratic in the traditional sense, who don't seem to rely on the institutions that constitution set up. So until you have some clarity internally, it's much harder to know what you stand for abroad. And you can see this confusion almost every day. You see the kinds of criticism you get. Then we get defensive and we say, oh, what the hell do they know? They're all hypocrites. And we are different. We are unique. But the moment we start doing that and climbing back into our shell, then frankly, I think we've lost it. We actually run the risk of missing the bus of creating a prosperous and secure India if we do that. And that's why I keep saying we do best when we're most connected and most engaged with the world. We need the world today if we want to transform India. Practical policy is easier, actually, because there's enough experience, there are enough smart people in India. That's not, I think, so hard. But there is a problem of grand strategy, of prioritizing, of deciding what's important. And what I've seen in the last few years makes me think that we've lost the plot in a sense. As we were saying earlier, we're not concentrating on what is most important for the transformation of India. What can actually stop us from India becoming the kind of India that we want? If we don't even know what it is, but worse than that, we don't even prioritize things according to how they affect that. And if we are chasing image, we're chasing status, or we're chasing revenge, or, whichever, you want a UN Security Council seat, for what? We've just seen how useless the UN Security Council is on COVID, on the West Asian crisis right now. And yet we want the recognition. We want the ego boost that we'll get as a result. For me, this is where there is no grand strategy. You've actually lost the vision that you used to have of the kind of world you wanted and of what kind of India you wanted to build. And that's why I end by saying, we have alternate futures. the I forget who it was who said the problem is that at some stage the path you walk on locks you in. You know, you become path dependent. But today you have a moment where the world is changing very rapidly. It's between orders. You yourself are changing. And this is a very changed India. This is an India with capabilities which we've never had before. And you have an opportunity when the world is between orders, when you yourself are going through this huge social and political churn and economic because of COVID, frankly, you will have to rebuild back to basics. So given that you have the choice, you now have a chance to turn crisis into opportunity, to do what you did on a smaller scale in 1991. And that's my plea, that please make the right choice, the choice that I would like, which I think I argue for through the book. I think it becomes quite clear from the book what my preference would be. But I'm sure there's other people with other views.
All right. No, that's perfect. That's a perfect way to end this conversation. Once again, Ambassador Menon, thank you so much for taking the time. And thank you so much for this absolutely wonderful book. And I would urge everybody to pick it up. I mean, apart from the big ideas, it's the little bits of information in between, which we were talking about, which I think really add color to everything, and the interconnections that he draws between events, personalities, and just the way balance of power shifts and how that impacts foreign policy. Thank you so much, Ambassador Menon. Thank you so much, Suyash and Nitansha. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. Thanks, Suyash. Thanks, Nitansha. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir.